The roar of 80,000 voices filled the night sky like thunder. The stadium lights swept across a sea of faces, all united in song, as Freddie Mercury strutted across the stage with that unmistakable energy only he could summon. The band was in perfect sync, the crowd was electric, and for a moment it felt as if nothing in the world could disturb that harmony. But then, in a single heartbeat, the air shifted. A glint of glass caught the light as an object hurtled toward the stage. Before anyone could react, a heavy bottle of glass smashed at Freddie's feet, exploding into sharp fragments that scattered across the platform. The music cut like a knife through silence as the impact echoed, louder in the hearts of the fans than through the speakers themselves. The audience gasped in horror. People in the front rows instinctively stepped back, covering their mouths, while others shouted angrily toward the direction the bottle had come from. The joyous symphony of the night had been shattered into a jarring stillness, the kind of silence that only true fear can bring. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Freddie Mercury, frozen, his eyes fixed on the shards sparkling at his boots like tiny stars fallen from the sky. For a long, unbearable moment, Freddie did not move. The microphone hung loosely in his hand, its silver glint catching the stage lights as his gaze remained fixed on the shattered glass at his boots. The cheers, the music, the rhythm of the night, all had been stolen by that single violent act. The crowd's confusion rippled like a wave. Some shouted for security, others screamed in anger at the faceless culprit lost somewhere in the dark sea of people. The band members looked toward Freddie, waiting for a cue, unsure whether to continue playing or stop completely. All eyes rested on him, the man at the center of chaos, whose next gesture would decide the fate of the night. Freddie finally lifted his head. His eyes swept over the crowd with an intensity sharp enough to pierce the tension. He did not lash out with fury. He did not curse nor retreat. Instead, he stood utterly still, his silence louder than any note he could have sung. It was a stare that froze 80,000 souls in place, a moment that transformed fear into anticipation, as the world waited to see what Freddie Mercury would do next. It was not the first time Freddie Mercury had faced hostility. The mid-1980s were a turbulent era, a world wrestling with change and unrest. Rock concerts were not just entertainment, they were battlegrounds of culture, identity, and rebellion. For a man like Freddie, who defied every label society tried to impose, the stage was both sanctuary and crucible. He stood at the very heart of admiration and prejudice, adored by millions, yet constantly scrutinized by those who could not accept his freedom. In those days, the tension in the air was almost palpable. Music festivals and stadium shows carried the risk of chaos, and the line between adoration and aggression was thin. A single object hurled from the shadows could turn joy into danger. That bottle was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the intolerance, envy, and fear that Freddie had faced all his life. To the man who threw it, it might have been just an impulsive act of spite. But to everyone watching, it carried a heavier meaning. For Freddie, the attack was not only physical, it was personal. He had endured slurs whispered backstage, gossip printed in tabloids, and judgment cast upon his every gesture. The glass shards glittering at his feet were a reminder of that lifelong struggle, of a society that tried to break him for daring to live unapologetically. Yet Freddie never believed in bowing to cruelty. He believed in transforming it, and so, in that moment, the crowd was not only witnessing an interruption to the concert, they were witnessing history unfold, a confrontation between hate and dignity, violence and art. What Freddie would do next would not simply decide the outcome of a performance. It would echo far beyond the walls of that stadium, carried in memory for generations. The seconds dragged on like hours. The silence in the stadium was thick, almost unbearable, as the tension climbed higher with every heartbeat. The band members exchanged nervous glances. Brian May gripped his guitar, but held back. Roger Taylor tapped his drumsticks against his leg, unsure whether to break the stillness or wait. No one dared to move without Freddie's signal, Security guards rushed to the front rows, scanning the crowd in a frantic attempt to find the culprit. Angry fans pointed in every direction, shouting accusations and curses. The atmosphere, once electric with joy, now crackled with hostility. It felt as though the entire stadium was balancing on a knife's edge, and a single spark could ignite chaos. Freddie remained in place, his figure illuminated by the spotlight, a solitary statue in a storm of uncertainty. His body was still, but his presence dominated the space. Every eye was locked on him, 80,000 people waiting, praying, fearing what would come next. Would he explode in rage? Would he walk away? The suspense was suffocating, and then, as if sensing the desperation of the crowd, Freddie took a slow, deliberate step forward. The shards of glass crunched softly beneath his boot, the sound echoing louder than the music that had been cut short. It was not just a step across the stage. It was a step into history. The world leaned closer, ready to witness how one man would confront hate in front of thousands. Freddie stopped just inches from the scattered shards. The lights above cast a cold shimmer across the glass, making them sparkle like broken stars at his feet. He lowered his microphone slowly, the metal tip grazing against the stage until it touched a fragment of the bottle. The sound, a faint scrape, was magnified by the silence of 80,000 people holding their breath. The band froze in suspense, their instruments hanging in midair. Security held back, unsure if Freddie was about to erupt or walk away. The fans, still on edge, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on their hearts. For a man whose voice could fill stadiums, his silence was deafening, and it stretched into something almost unbearable. Then, with a sharp glance toward the crowd, Freddie leaned into the microphone. His voice, calm but cutting like steel, broke the silence. "Is this what you came for?" The question pierced the night, echoing across the arena with brutal clarity. It wasn't shouted, it was spoken, but it carried more power than any scream. The audience erupted, not in anger, but in a storm of applause, whistles, and cries. The tension snapped, replaced by a tidal wave of support. The faceless attacker was drowned out by a united roar. In that single phrase, Freddie had turned the insult back onto the crowd, forcing them to reckon with their own devotion. He wasn't the victim. He was still the master of the stage. Freddie did not stop at words. With deliberate slowness, he bent down, his hand hovering just above the shards of glass that moments earlier had threatened to wound him. The crowd collectively gasped, some fearing he might cut himself, others unable to fathom what he was about to do. His fingers closed gently around a larger fragment, and he rose again. Holding it up high under the blinding stage lights, the shard glimmered like a diamond, reflecting beams of red, blue, and gold from the spotlights. In Freddie's hand, it no longer looked like trash hurled in anger. It looked like a relic, transformed by the sheer audacity of his gesture. The crowd was mesmerized, frozen between fear and awe, as the glass that symbolized hate became an object of beauty in his grasp. Freddie raised the shard above his head, then brought the microphone to his lips. With a half smile and a tone both mocking and defiant, he declared, "Even broken things can shine." The words carried across the arena, an unexpected sermon woven into the theater of rock. For a man who lived every day in defiance of the world's expectations, this was more than a comeback. It was a proclamation. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Waves of applause and cheers crashed against the stage, drowning out any trace of hostility. What had begun as an act of malice was now immortalized as a moment of defiance and transformation. Freddie had taken hate itself and turned it into history, right before their eyes. As the thunder of applause began to fade, Freddie lowered the shard of glass and let it rest carefully on the edge of the stage, as if it were now part of the show. He straightened his posture, adjusted the microphone stand, and without another word, signaled the band with a subtle nod. It was time to turn pain into performance. Brian May's guitar rang out with a soaring chord, Roger Taylor's drums rolled like distant thunder, and John Deacon's bass throbbed through the ground. Freddie gripped the microphone stand like a sword, his voice cutting through the night with renewed force. He launched into a ballad of resilience, his voice carrying not just melody, but defiance, filling the stadium with a wave of sound that washed over the remnants of violence. The music grew louder, stronger, as though the band itself had been ignited by the drama. Every note felt heavier, more meaningful, as if Queen was no longer just performing a concert. They were reclaiming the stage from hatred. The very act of playing became an answer, a refusal to let anger have the final word. Freddie prowled the stage with renewed fire, his eyes daring the crowd to remember this moment not as one of fear, but of triumph. The song became a shield, an anthem forged in defiance, and the fans, swept away by the power of it, knew they were witnessing something far beyond music. The energy in the stadium shifted as if a storm cloud had lifted. What moments earlier had been fear and hostility now surged into something unifying, almost sacred. The fans, who had gasped in shock at the bottle's crash, were now on their feet, clapping in rhythm, their voices rising to meet Freddie's. The arena trembled with a collective roar, no longer divided by anger, but fused together in awe. Freddie fed on their response, his every movement magnified by the crowd's devotion. He extended his arms wide, as though embracing the entire audience, daring them to sing with him. Thousands obeyed, their voices intertwining with his, creating a chorus so immense it seemed to swallow the night sky. The hate that had entered the stadium minutes before had been completely drowned beneath a tidal wave of love. Tears streaked down faces in the front rows, grown men who had lived through wars, young fans who had only just discovered their idol, and families who had come to share a night of music. They weren't just watching a concert anymore. They were part of a miracle, part of a moment when music proved more powerful than violence. Even the security guards, still scanning the audience for the culprit, found themselves pausing, moved by the sound of 80,000 voices united as one. What could have ended in chaos had become a symphony of resilience, conducted by Freddie Mercury himself. By the time the final notes faded into the night, the story had already begun to spread. Reporters stationed near the stage scribbled furiously into their notebooks, while photographers snapped images of Freddie standing tall with the shard of glass at his feet. They knew instinctively this was not just another concert, it was an event destined for tomorrow's headlines. Across the city, radios buzzed with hurried updates. Callers flooded the stations, their voices still trembling with excitement, describing how Freddie had turned violence into a moment of triumph. One announcer, almost breathless, declared, "Mercury has given us not just music tonight, but history." The narrative of the bottle was no longer about the attack itself, but about how Freddie had transformed it. The newspapers of the next morning captured the drama in ink and image. Some carried the photo of Freddie lifting the shard, his arm illuminated like a prophet holding a torch. Others printed his cutting words in bold across the front page. "Is this what you came for?" The attack was mentioned, yes, but always as a footnote to the greater story. His defiance and the unbreakable bond between artist and audience. Even those who had not been there felt the weight of it. Strangers stopped each other in cafes and train stations to retell the story, as if they had witnessed it firsthand. It was no longer just Queen's fans who were speaking about it. It was the entire nation, captivated by how one man had turned a symbol of hate into a hymn of unity. In the years that followed, the story of that night refused to fade. Fans who had been there told it to their children, who told it again to theirs, until it became more than a memory. It became a legend. The details of the concert, the setlist, even the city, began to blur in recollection. But one image remained crystal clear. Freddie Mercury, holding a shard of glass aloft, turning hatred into light. Musicians and performers often spoke of the moment as a lesson. It wasn't just about stage presence or showmanship, but about courage. The courage to face humiliation, danger, and violence without surrendering dignity. Freddie had shown the world that true artistry was not only about the songs one sang, but about the way one chose to stand in the face of cruelty. Historians, too, would later cite the event as one of the defining symbols of the 1980s music scene. It was a decade filled with turbulence, with battles for identity and respect. And here was a single act, simple, defiant, that embodied the struggle of an entire generation. The broken glass became more than debris. It became a metaphor of transformation, of resilience, of grace under fire. Even now, decades later, when fans gather to honor Freddie's memory, the story of the bottle always resurfaces. It reminds the world that while voices may falter and lights may dim, the spirit of defiance against hate never dies. In that moment, Freddie Mercury didn't just perform a song, he rewrote the meaning of music itself. And so, dear friends, that night was never remembered for the violence of a bottle, but for the brilliance of a man who refused to bow to hate. Freddie Mercury transformed a moment meant to wound him into a living symbol of courage, dignity, and art. Where there could have been silence and fear, he gave song and defiance. Where there could have been division, he gave unity. It was not just a concert, it was a lesson. A reminder that greatness is not measured by the obstacles we avoid, but by the way we rise when those obstacles are hurled at our feet. Freddie did not answer with rage. He answered with music, with wit, and with a gesture that turned broken glass into shining history. Today, that story still lingers in the hearts of millions, whispered from one generation to the next. Because what Freddie taught us is timeless. Hatred can be loud, but love and art will always sing louder. And in that arena, on that night, 80,000 people learned it together. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in the power of music to heal and inspire. Have you ever witnessed a moment where compassion defeated cruelty? Tell us in the comments below. And if Freddie's courage touched you today, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so that his spirit may live on, not just in history, but in us.